Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Grit City Think and Drink. I'm your host, Jim Gell. I'm a faculty, for some of you who don't know me, which are very few. I'm a faculty member at UW Tacoma in environmental sciences in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences. I should mention my bosses because they help sponsor this event, or at least give me my time and help figure things out. So welcome. For those of you who don't know, I'll give you a quick blurb about the Think and Drink. This happens the second Tuesday of every month, has been going for, this is almost the end of our 5th year, I think, of running this event. So hopefully in the 6th year, we will get back in person at a place as yet to be determined. If you have ideas for where we should go in Tacoma to host the live event, definitely chat that to me if you have ideas where we can fit somewhere between 50 and 100 people while eating and drinking and listening to talks. With that, I wanted to point out our next talk is the second Tuesday in December. Ricky Thompson is going to talk about the politics of matching, messaging, and making the first move in online dating, which should be a great talk. And there she is waving at us. Hi, Ricky. We are now getting scheduling for 2022. So if you have ideas of people that would make good speakers, if you want to give a talk, please just email me and we'll pick a month and you can get scheduled. It would be lovely to get some of the folks in the room here to give some talks or to hear from you who you're interested in hearing from. So let us know and we'll get people on the calendar for 2022. So the way this is going to work tonight, I will introduce our fabulous speaker, Dr. Modarres, and then after he gives an amazing talk to knock your socks off, we will actually replace those with socks. So you can win Think and Drink socks. They're definitely a collector's items. We'll have a trivia thing to give away a couple of pairs of those, so stick around for that. And then right after that is our question and answer, where you can play Stump the Speaker and ask him all sorts of questions that he may or may not be prepared for. And we'll end this by 7:30 so that you can get out while it's still dark, since it's been dark now for 2 hours and will continue to be dark until tomorrow. So without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker. Dr. Modarres earned his Ph.D. in geography from the University of Arizona, holds a master's and bachelor's degrees in landscape architecture from the same institution. He has published in the areas of social geography, immigration, urban development, planning, and policy. He's focused on a significant portion of his public scholarship on economic development through an equity lens that includes global labor migration within the larger political and economic discourses. He's on the advisory board for a book series, several book series, serves on editorial boards of multiple journals, and he is one of 2 founding editors of the new journal Race, Ethnicity, and the City. Through his career, he has built bridges between the university and the community, promoting and supporting the mission of urban serving universities, and currently runs our Office of Community Engagement. So without further ado, Dr. Modarres, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Jim. And actually, the office is run by Carly and Julia. So I just basically just stand around and watch all the great work they do. Thank you for the introduction. It was supposed to be my name, rank, and serial number, but it became a little bit more than that. I apologize to the folks who are here with us, and I'm sorry that you didn't have anything better to do than to hear me talk about furniture. So with that, I just want to make sure I provide a bit of context. Most of you who know me, this is not a topic I talk about publicly. I don't think anybody has ever heard me give this type of talk. Most of my work is around global labor migration and economic development and around housing issues. And this topic has roots for many years of my thinking about how spaces, especially interior spaces, changed in our lives. I grew up in a traditional home where the entire house was an O shape. You moved from in summer and in winter, and different parts of the house accommodated different sort of seasons, which meant that furniture moved with you. And in my lifetime, I saw how things changed. I moved to a house in which suddenly there was a bedroom and there was a dining room and there was a hall, as the great room of the Persian houses are called. And eventually what became interesting for me to see is that as I went through life in Iran, I began to see how that interior space has changed. And in the architecture school, I was puzzled by the stencil that was given to us for furniture, because it wasn't good enough to design a room. You had to put the furniture in it to identify what it was. Years of thinking about this brought me to a number of books and publications, and I switched over to social science at some point from design, and still thought about these objects that fill our rooms and fill our spaces. And what became fascinating to me is that as I was reading, and my colleagues here know these names, Walter Benjamin and others, I noticed the obsession about the interior space was not mine alone. A lot of people thought about the transformation of our houses and that what it meant. I read about bars and cafes, and one of the things that quite fascinated me was how Europeans adopted American bar, which in fact was in and itself a design innovation that allowed for the fast movement of drinks, which is the topic related to this, the name of this talk. You could actually slide a drink down the bar, and Europeans loved that. And what needs to be understood was the innovation that went into incorporation of zinc into the topping of the bars that allowed for that slide to happen properly, or the way that Americans treated other objects or other surfaces for that fast movement. Move forward in time, and I got to know chair designers in LA and watched them with fascination as they dedicated their lives to creating objects that either ended up in Target or they were designer pieces. Regardless, as I began to read, a little book came my way, and I will talk about the 1980s book, but the book that really intrigued me was a little book called The Emergence of the Interior, Architecture, Modernity, and Domesticity. And so for that, this is one of those books that I read many times, and I have done lectures from it, but not to the audience here. It's primarily in LA and other places. So bear with me as I walk you through something of a lecture, which is actually wanderings of mine. So for me, decorating the room is like playing chess with yourself, hoping to win. And that essentially means the struggle that we have with furniture and the dialogue that we have with furniture. But what this talk is all about is not necessarily for me to talk to you about the genealogy. It is of a specific piece of furniture. There are specific scholars who can tell you all you want to know about the evolution of chairs, the evolution of tables, and everything about it. The one element that they have all in common is human dimension, and that's fundamental to understanding furniture. Also, I'm not going to talk about really expensive furniture pieces, designer pieces. In the furniture world, the designer, the architect and designer Alvar Aalto is well known. This piece could cost anywhere from $30,000 and higher. These are the kind of furniture that eventually came into our lives, and I will get that in a second. What I want to focus is the following: furniture and its purpose, which is really identified by many scholars as three items: class, comfort, and privacy. And to that, we can add also domesticity, which I will add toward the latter part of my talk. This is not also something that's just a modern form of consideration and thinking. We do know from various scholars how different cultures accommodated furniture. But we know, for example, despite what you see in Hollywood movies, Roman houses were sparsely furnished, and privacy and comfort were not central to the design of interior spaces of everyday life of Romans. What we have from the archaeological work is that we do have some pieces of furniture from their time, but it is not that their houses were designed in the way that we imagine them. In fact, Roman life is usually depicted as one of excess, which is far from their actual daily life. And even though they had banquets, those were not everyday life of Romans. Most Romans lived in apartments that were typically rented, and they were unfurnished. They had few rooms, and those were typically multifunctional, Only the few upper class could organize banquets in their houses. So right from the beginning, the nature of furniture in your interior spaces defined your class, and that was identifiable. And we see that theme throughout time. Not everything depicted by as Roman was originally Roman. For example, this whole reclining and eating, which is the reclining during meals in the movies, thanks to Hollywood and the way the Western imagination has gone, that Romans actually did that. Actually, this came from Persians via Greece. The name for Roman dining room furniture was triclinium, which is 3 couches. It was actually not the furniture, it was what was on it that made Romans the site of envy from other cultures. And if you think about the design of the rooms for these tricliniums, you would identify houses that in fact had 4 separate dining spaces that allowed them to arrange these U-shapes for conversation purposes. And servants typically would sit around or stand around and watch these upper class engage with their eating. So these are rare. And to be honest with you, one thing that we don't hear about is the following, that of the thousands of houses that were in Rome, only a small number of them could do this. Majority of them were apartment dwellers, and they did not have this kind of space. But Romans were aware of the importance of furniture, fashion, and cultural practices, and they knew how they could use that to interrupt and subvert the cultures of the subjects of their vast empire. So they began the practice of exporting their way of life to far corners of their empire that historians refer to as Romanization. I have to apologize to historians in this space. I am going to run through time really fast, and I know it makes every historian cringe, but that's a way for me to make the point that across time, furniture has had that same subject. And we know that for a fact that they used fashion and furniture and ways of being, because we have the historian Tacitus, who happened to be the son-in-law of Agricola, who was the governor of England, and watched all of this. And if you read this passage, toward the latter part of it, you can see that even a historian of the time understood that as these fashion and these forms of furniture was brought into these cultures and they began to mimic the way of life that Romans had, they lost their culture. They functioned differently. That's not that different from what we see in our 19th and 20th century practices, in which colonial practices was to introduce English or the French way of living. And this is the depiction of a room, a government room in Calcutta, in India, in the time that now this new way of life was being introduced once again through furniture, through ways of eating and through ways of being. Now, what is interesting is that if you look at images from the Middle Ages, you don't see furniture as a form of comfort, but you recognize the pieces. This is the famous painting of St. Jerome in his study circa 1514. And for those of you who know the Christian stories and histories, you know why there is a lion in front of this painting. And this saint is the one who removed thorn from the paws of a lion, but we'll leave that one alone. Notice that the desk, the chair, the cushions on them, those are all recognizable by us at this point, because we're beginning to realize that a study even in that time had the specific forms of furniture on it, and we could use there. Actually, the tablet, the site that he has, that tilted table, would be perfect for an iPad, if you ask me. And that would work so well. But this form of furniture still doesn't suggest more things to come. So not everyone enjoyed soft bed. The first of the merchant class began to use this. This was the bourgeois class. And actually the word bourgeois did not show up until 11th century France. And these town dwellers began to acquire furniture for their lives, for their houses. These pieces were minimal in purpose, and they were multifunctional, like a bed being also a chair or a seat or seating space. Chairs, even though had been introduced by Romans to various parts of Europe, was largely forgotten during the medieval period. And furniture was largely, even for the nobility, largely portable, which meant you moved it from one location to another. house as a private space or home had not fully found its place in the European society during the medieval period. So now, as you begin to think about these interior spaces, you have to understand them that they're kind of continuing the Roman tradition of house not really being anything but bringing a little bit of work into it as well, or more. The book in the 1980s that actually tried to unpack the history of home is a 1986 book in which 4 themes were addressed by the author: home, privacy, comfort, and intimacy. And in fact, the later writing, not his, would introduce a 5th element to that, and that's the idea of domesticity that is associated with interior spaces. But one of the things that this author points out is how the word even comfort is not the same thing that in the medieval period would be understood. It was not used to identify relaxing as a domestic amenity. Actually, the comforter was the Holy Spirit. A comforter now for us is what we throw on a bed. So that's basically the changes that you also see in language that evolved over time. Privacy and domesticity, the 2 great discoveries of bourgeois age, appeared in Europe only by 18th century, ready to be exported at the time of colonial practices. A house became a home when it was no longer a place to work. And if it was to function as an intimate and private space, it would need a true expression of comfort. Soft upholstery, velvet, and padding came to define places to sit, stretch, sleep, and embrace comfort mediated by object. There is a French theoretician and architect well known at the time of the French Revolution, Jacques-François Blondel, who there's a quote from him that good taste consists in joining together commodity, firmness, and delight. These objects then came to express what it meant to be upper class or servant, civilized or otherwise. At Versailles, we see this manifestation. I mean, when you think about furniture, why not think about the Sun King? During the reign of Louis XIV, armchairs were reserved specifically for the Sun King. Chairs without arms were reserved for members of the immediate royal entourage. Backless stools could be used by certain members of the nobility, and unpadded folding stools by lesser notables. This was the true meaning of putting people in their places. Now, the era that followed, the death of Louis XIV, which is that period that is also known in the world of design and history as the Rococo era, which coincides with Philip II, Duke of Orleans. And then Louis XV gave birth to what Victorian would see as hedonism. It was an era filled with pursuit of pleasure and the growing importance of intimacy. Interior spaces by necessity became even more plush, filled with more comfortable furniture. This is where furniture that you and I see with those paddings and those capabilities show up. This is the era that coincides again the colonial expansion of France and England. Occupation had to be accessorized. They had to show what occupation looked like and what was the French and the English way of life. Furniture and fashion were the medium to transfer the interior spaces of colonial subjects. And this is somewhat brilliant if you think about it, because if the outer spaces, if the urban spaces were occupied by colonial forces, the one place that they had not got into is into people's houses. And this is how subjugation worked and how that space was turned around. And that's how European aesthetics turned into global commodities circulating among the emerging middle classes everywhere. Was this the neo-Romanization? Well, you can tell from my tone what I'm trying to say. The growth of economy, these exchanges of commodities and the acquisition of wealth, especially during the colonial period, meant there was a growing interest in these objects. Domestic comfort and search for it coincides the emergence of something new in human consciousness, or the civility that was defining it as the appearance of the internal world of the individual, of the self, of the family, that puts the appearance of comfort and domesticity at the birthplace of home as a private space. And that's only 200 to 300 years ago. Intimacy finds its expression in the 17th century interior spaces also. What we call a bedroom would be called cabinet de l'amour, salle à manger would be our dining room, and the gentleman's house would gradually being shaped. And when I say gentleman's house, I want you to realize that was a terminology that was used by architects to define a specific form of architecture. It was gradually being shaped by creating distinct spaces and functions within a house, and nothing signifies each function better than appropriately designed and named furniture. Now we know where beds go, we know where dining tables go, and what's the difference between a dining table and a desk. And as a student, both of them were the same. So what we begin to see in the scholarship of this area in the issues of furniture is the role of microgeographies of power that now has these gender dimensions built into them within a house. Creation of small spaces of comfort and intrigue, and nothing epitomized privacy and comfort better than the image of an odalisque surrounded by plush fittings. And if you look at the paintings of the time, you get my meaning here. And then there were these, the items we still have. During the Victorian era, you know, the outfits that women wore basically would would leave them breathless. And so chaise lounge or fainting couch came to be as a way of understanding that. But also there are stories about, this is one myth of the origin of this. The other one is about the fact that these were created in the bedrooms of the upper class because they would not turn down their own bed. They would sit on these until maids would turn down their bed so they could get in them. But chaise lounge turned into different kind of designs over time. This is one in 3 parts. And by the end of the 19th century, because everything Middle Eastern apparently seemed quite comfortable, and that those cushions that were so nice and firm and velvety had to be used. So as they went through the neoclassical period in late 18th century, by 19th century, we see the Turkish fainting couch showing up in Europe. This is a fascinating era in which we begin to see this number of furniture showing up. There is a lot written about this issue of how the colonial processes worked. And I'm not going to go through all of them with you, but I just wanted to mention both the Gentleman's House, which was Robert Kerr's writing, and also the issue of how these things worked. So colonial domesticity is really an important element to think about. Furniture helped create images of domestic life in a way that could be exported and imported at will, and the agents in them are quite fascinating. These are 2 images from the book I mentioned to you, The Emergence of the Interior by Charles Rice, in which he talks about how the idea of the English domesticity was carried by Englishmen and Englishwomen into other spaces. The picture to the left is in Germany, the picture to the right is in Australia. Actually, the pieces that you see in Robert and Joanna Barr Smith's room actually was put on a boat, sent on a ship and sent actually to Australia so they could reconstruct the English way of life. Now, I'm not going to spend time here telling you about all the gender dynamics and the power structures and how these furnitures work and the fact that she's keeping the heat, the right temperature for the tea and all that. But this is a part of that idea of domestic life and how one is and how one lives. And the furniture associated with the so-called civilized occupiers created a form of desire for acquisition among the subjects. This would have not been possible without marketing. And then we have scholars who have done writing on that, and the critical theorists among you know about the book that I mentioned first, but also there are more recent writing around this whole issue of consuming colonialism. Now, I wanted to show you a visual. So if you were to depict a Victorian era room, and this is not one, if you were just to depict one, this is more or less what it would look like. Now the question is, where's this? And I can answer that question. This is what now you would find in an upper middle class home, perhaps among Iranians. This is how furniture traveled, and still hundreds of years later, after Louis XV and Louis XIV, some of these pieces of furniture are circulating as a sign of civility. There are factories dedicated to producing lower value versions of them, and you can go to the furniture section of the city and buy all of these gaudy furniture if you wish. But at the same time, Europeans began to import and reappropriate cultural elements from other parts of the world. This is the Egyptian room designed by Thomas Hope, who couldn't stop imagining European places as a way of collection. This is the site of the collection. And in this design, he actually introduces all these Egyptian metaphors or Egyptian shapes and aesthetics into that. And this is a sofa that is attributed to him in terms of design. This is how this worked, imagining how Egyptians might have lived, and on the other side, Egyptians imagining how Europeans live through the site of this colonial exchange. Modernity and retreat to interior spaces meant that gradually there was a loss of communal spaces. And as Walter Benjamin and others have written about, this idea of trace of long experiences became important as anonymity became prevalent in the city. Long experience was transferred into interior space and mapped against objects like furniture. And next time when somebody talks about this is my grandma's dresser or grandfather's clock, and I inherited this from my dad or mom, this is how through furniture we establish long experience. Interior spaces gradually become a site of collection. And to quote the scholars who work on this topic is that to exchange and use value, one now needs to add the connoisseur value, what we collect and how the collection matters. By the end of the 19th century, design and arts had found a way to take over the interior space through aesthetics, and what we call today designer pieces came into our interior spaces. This is a Jugendstil Art Nouveau sofa from the end of the 19th century. Gradually, artists and designers got involved. And as you know, today, many architects also design furniture pieces. And by the beginning of the 20th century, people like Alvar Aalto, the first chair that I showed you, began to design pieces of furniture because no longer there was a boundary between the outside and the inside. An important development of the 19th and 20th century was the arrival of home economics, that discipline that when I came to the United States still was taught. It was a major at the University of Arizona. Largely the attendees of those majors were women, and which introduced really more commodities into American household and by extension to other countries. Comfort was designed as speed and efficiency, think Instapots, less time dedicated to work and more time to relaxation. This association of women with furniture was not just what happened at home. It began to go everywhere and in every space. And in this design and this painting by Edward Hopper, which is a hotel lobby, you can see how furniture comes to be and how familiar this space is to you, especially if you have been through boutique spaces, boutique hotels, and you know how furniture plays a role in the lobby of a hotel. But notice the layers of meaning that are embedded in this particular painting. So in the 20th century, as the nature of work began to change due to industrialization, comfort, privacy, and escape from everyday routine gave interior spaces and by extension, furniture a different meaning. The interior became a dreamscape, and I to quote, and furniture a commodity circulating with an economy that trades on desire and exhaustion. As furniture filled our spaces of everyday life, we started to classify spaces by the furniture found in them. You and I recognize spaces that way. So after years of training, we know places by the furniture in them. We can tell where a bedroom is, living room is, family room, library, classroom, office, and specifically an executive's office or a clerk's office. These pieces of furniture speak to us without even talking, and we read them without any effort. They talk and we listen. Next time when you're attempting to rearrange your room, notice how they talk to you. I hope you see your sofa differently, understand why you keep moving it around. And all I can tell you, I wish my desk would stop talking to me while I was working. Thank you so much.
Ali, that was amazing. That's why I so much enjoy hosting this thing, as I learn something so different each time that I get a chance to do this. So that was fantastic. Folks, if you have questions, you can chat them at any point. We have lots of time for questions, but I want to give away a couple pairs of socks since you just had yours knocked off of you by a great talk. I usually come up with factoids that are not thoroughly researched, but you're going to have to deal with that. And they are somewhat related to the talk's topic of tonight. Bear with me. So get your chat fingers ready. That's how you're going to answer. So the first person to answer these questions correctly gets a pair of socks. To get your socks, since we are not in person, you need to chat to me, since nobody else can see it, your mailing address so that I can get it to you. If you happen to be, since there's quite a few of UW employees, you can just let me know your box number and I will get it to you in an envelope. But whichever you need me, let me know how to get it to you and what size are you? So they come in either small or medium/large, and they are unisex, which means men's in the world of fashion. So if you let me know those info, you can get your pair of socks. And here goes the first trivia question. There is on the UW Tacoma campus a former furniture manufacturer that is now one of our buildings. Name the name of that furniture manufacturer, or the name of the building. Oh, Julia's on it in a heartbeat. First one off the board. Harmon is correct. I even, just so I can share the silly little thing that I just found, you can see a chairs for defense. So believe it or not, that chair was put on a Boeing airplane. So that's what you used to sit in when you rode in an airplane. And it was made by the Harmon Furniture Company, which was billed as the Grand Rapids. This area in Tacoma was tried to be billed as the Grand Rapids of the West, which is where my parents live right now, is Grand Rapids. So this was trying to say that this was the hot new place to make furniture. So yes, somewhat related to Ali. So maybe we can get him to do a historical talk on the change in furniture in Tacoma fashions at some point in the future. That would be a great talk. So, all right. So Julia, I know how to get a pair of socks to you. You just have to let me know what size you want. Next question, everybody get their fingers ready. Because of furniture on the West Coast being largely influenced by the standards in California. We know that Ali was spending time down in the Southwest. Well, California's market for furniture is so big that whatever it requires of its furniture is required of everything in Washington State and up the coast, unfortunately. So California actually has a requirement that all cushions and even children's clothing require a certain chemical that is a carcinogen. So it's really hard to get furniture in Washington State that doesn't have this kind of chemical in its cushions. Do you know what it is? What class? You don't have to know the name of the chemical. What class of chemicals? Oh, Andrea, right off the bat, flame retardant, you are correct. So yes, the California market, if you've gone looking for something that doesn't have it in it, it's really hard to find in Washington State. And it's a good thing when you find it. So yeah, flame retardants are added because of the California market to almost all the stuff that gets up here in Washington State. So congratulations to the sock winners. Thank you all for playing Jim's Stupid Trivia. And let's hear some questions. So if you have questions, please chat those in there for Ali, and I will feed them to him. So Ali, I had a question for you to start it off. So when did we start to differentiate? You mentioned sort of that inside space. So I feel like at some point, what furniture goes in public space, like that has a thing now, right? There's a whole industry just around what you should put in boardrooms and things along those lines. So where did that start?
That's really the industrial age when that begins to be defined. And that's what I meant by the years. And in every country is a little bit different. So if you think about it, our industrial age in the United States is delayed. Doesn't happen the same time as the European era. However, the idea of office furniture in the way that you and I are thinking about it, that is mostly a 20th century phenomenon. It's not really even a 19th century. There are some basic elements of it, but for example, cubicles and the way we use them in 20th century, or we use them in 20th century, we still use them. That wasn't the part of how you did this work. Now the furniture, there's another part to it. There is something called street furniture. I'm answering a question you haven't asked. Called street, I learned that from politicians. Street furniture is actually something that shows up later in the conversation. And that happens as a part of, and particularly this is an English beginning, in which we begin to see relaxation time for the public. So the idea of traveling to a specific place to have a good time, or you're going for a walk, or the idea of being seen in perfect outfits. And you see this in depiction of the old times in movies. That required benches, and that required some element to it. But what really signified the change in the city was the introduction of electricity. Once electricity was introduced, now the time of the city had been doubled. And that essentially meant that we see more of these benches and so on. Unfortunately, in our time, we have modified them. And I'm happy to talk about what awful things we did with street furniture and why we removed them. But there was a significant amount of investment of thinking about walking, relaxing, sitting, interacting, because everyone still was trying to figure out a good way to create public space. But so back to your office question, yes, indeed. But many of these are the byproduct of the last 100 years or so. And then the idea of how it's not just the office and the home, it's really the public space as well.
Maisha wants to know, do you design furniture? And if so, where can we see it?
I actually don't design furniture, but I think I've spent enough time in design furniture, in studios for furniture design, that I could probably do one, but I'm not into, I'm more interested in the fascination that goes with the designer pieces now. I want to know where that came from. Because the designer pieces is another form of class expression. We all know about them. Who pays $30,000 for a chair?
Yep. She also wants to know, what's your favorite design period and why?
Oh, wow. You're going to do this to me. I actually like some of the Art Nouveau work. And the modern period is really interesting for the movements that the furniture have. You saw in Alto is very much known for the curvatures that he would introduce to objects and reimagining them in a particular way. That chair that I showed you actually turned into these cheaper pieces that now we can buy from Target and every other place that has that shape in it. So in some ways, modern pieces can be quite interesting, but modern pieces can be quite hard and very, very uncomfortable. And in many ways, Art Nouveau at least introduces some level of interest to the object.
I think that it's a follow-up to that. I was wondering, because it seems like originally that idea of furniture you talked about was cushioning, right? It was like the nobility or the rich people were allowed to be comfortable and to sit down. And at some point, we changed interior furnishings to be stylish and completely uncomfortable. And so that was when?
So that furniture that I told you about Louis XIV and going on to Louis XV, they're not comfortable at all. They're plush. But the idea of sitting up, which distinguished Europeans actually began to identify sitting upright as a form of civility, which meant that every culture that slouched and sat on the ground, that was not seen as proper. Now, it meant that chair was always a torturing piece for a lot of people if they had to sit on it for an extended amount of time. And that issue is why we still have chair designers. The ergonomic that was introduced later as a way of relaxing while sitting is a totally different kind of approach. Now, that doesn't mean it didn't have velvet on it. It didn't mean they were not plush. It's just very uncomfortable. When I go to the old country now, I'm not comfortable sitting on those pieces I showed you. I would rather just move over to something else.
Gotcha. I think that would make my office life so much better if I can get a velvet covering for my ergonomic chair. That would make me feel so much better. Leanne wants to know, this is a great question, how do you think the pandemic Zoom focus spaces, et cetera, are impacting furniture, if at all?
So great question, Leanne. I was hoping somebody would ask that question. In the last 2 years or 18 months or whatever, our interior spaces have become something else. We had learned to separate work and home. Not for academics, we work at home, it doesn't matter what. But in many ways, for us to imagine working in our office at home every day, 8, 9, 10 hours was not something that we had. And because of that, we have now, many of us have acquired new pieces in our houses to make that possible. Think about the lights that you have bought. Think about the chairs that you have changed. Think about the items that you have added to make that possible. So as we begin to imagine this new era in which there's an estimation that somewhere about 20 to 30% of people will permanently begin to work at home in either full-time or part-time, some days, we are going to see the interior space change. Actually, it has some tax ramification as well, which we can't get into that. But in some ways, the furniture is going to now find a new space and a new place for it for work. Now, that means that if you don't have an office, your bedroom is becoming office and a bedroom. But you will be able to tell, walking into somebody's house without even thinking about it, what area they work and what the area they relax.
Yep. I also think it blurs what goes in an office, right? I think that's starting to, people want to be, they want to walk that line of working, but also feeling comfortable at home. And so I think you're right. I think you can still tell, but it's a very different idea from what your office looks like to what your home office looks like. And it'll be interesting to see if that blurs back into the workplace where your office starts to take on home more.
Well, blurring the background that we do is actually our way of saying I'm separating my work from my private space. My public and my private can't mix.
Yeah. We have a question from Sean. He says, fashion has often been designed to make a political statement about the pressing issues of the day. Are there examples of furniture being designed with the same purpose in mind, to make a statement about an issue or topic?
I think I need clarification from Sean on that one. Are we talking about a piece of furniture that's controversial?
Sean, you can unmute and answer that.
Sure, yeah, I think could be controversial. I think of, Coco Chanel designing suits for women and what that did, how that revolutionized things, but just literally statements made by the design itself. There's a couple kind of furniture pieces I can think of, but just wondering what your thoughts were on that. Somebody introduced to literally say, hey, this is saying, class is a problem, and I'm going to address that in my design.
Yeah. So thank you, Sean. That's exactly, I think now I understand what you're asking. So yes, actually the problem of sitting was addressed by a number of designers who thought that in the furniture design, comfort had to be brought in. So those are the ones, that's one aspect of the furniture design that has been addressed. Also, many fashion designers began to get into furniture design, like Ralph Lauren actually shifted from fashion into furniture. So there's this boundary between that gets dissolved as well. Overall, the furniture pieces that get introduced toward introducing mass market is a way of engaging with the value structure or the exchange value of a piece. So the exchange value is addressed through the process of coming up with mass production, simplified forms of furniture that you can see some studios exactly are engaged with that. That's how it works out. It's the same way that in fashion, you would have outfits that are beyond reach, and then in the mass market would be cheaper to buy, but it's not quite designer pieces. I hope I addressed your question in the way you meant it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a little deeper version of that is like, you know, there's been anti-war fashion. Is there anti-war furniture that was done during the Vietnam era? I think that's something that's more of a strong statement by a furniture designer. Any examples of that you can think of?
I can't think of that, but I can think of the reason I remembered street furniture is that in our era, there has been a political reaction to the use of street furniture in a particular way. If you think about it, street furniture, we started adding arm sets on either side and in the middle. And the reason it was done, it was to make sure that homeless people can't sleep on them. And a lot of designers have modified that. So now we have folding public benches, which in fact, it goes the extra step of turning the back down to make it into a bed. So there are ways in which designers interact with social elements of their settings and introduce that. So when you think about a city that has introduced that kind of furniture, you can see the designer and the policymakers are seeing eye to eye.
Great, thank you.
Definitely, that's something that I've noticed in airports. The US airports don't allow you to lay on furniture in the airport, even if you have a layover, whereas most international places have actual couches and places that are comfortable. Julia says that as someone with a design background and one who has an indelible sense of fashion, what is more important, form or function?
Oh boy. You know, every time this comes up, I'm reminded of a quote that says forms follows fiasco. And it is really function in many ways. But I have to give to my aesthetically obsessed design friends this thing that it takes a lot for a designer to separate themselves from the objects they create. You have to be very sure of yourself to do that. And for me, while function matters, form is how we introduce new ways of understanding the world, right? So if we just went by the function of sitting, form would never advance. Form and function have to be together in order for them to be able to do what they need to do. We use function in architecture to create grid design, and the international style was rejected publicly. What came out of that era is not the kind of architecture we think about. That's really was about function and about lowering the cost, but it was rejected. So I would say primarily, I still think function is important, but without form, we would not have those elements of distinction, of difference. We all in life are looking for something that distinguishes us. As much as we enjoy anonymity in the city, we hate to be anonymous.
Andrea would like said related question. You mentioned the gender dynamics of furniture and interior design in the past. Do you think the pandemic has blurred or sharpened such distinctions?
It's a difficult one to answer. Just leave it to that question to be asked. So it's the gender divide in furniture still is strong. The assumptions of who buys what and who uses what in space is still out there. Pandemic hasn't changed very much any of that. However, as we begin to see work brought to the house and work introduced into different spaces, that functional structure of spaces will be modified. In other words, the furniture that will be in bedroom will no longer be just the bed and the dresser. And so as this begins to happen, some elements of gender divide that went with that spatial divide will manifest itself in a different way. But it's very difficult to say if the furniture as a design object will change.
Any other questions, folks? If not, I want to thank our speaker one more time. A virtual round of applause from everybody. You can actually show your face if you would like to, folks. Thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you for a wonderful talk. That was really, really fun. And now I'm going to go peruse all the furniture in my house and figure out exactly why and what it does. Although I feel like there's also such a collection as whatever came cheaply or from other grad students, which I still believe I have some of. So we'll talk about that later, but thank you all very much. Hope to see you in December for our next speaker, Ricky Thompson. Let's hear it for her. And everybody have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thank you for spending your evening with me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Bye, folks.